Commission members okay?
Yes.
All righty, let's roll. Sounds good. Right, it's just a few minutes past 1 o'clock. The 7th meeting of the Citizens Commission on Elected Officials' Compensation will now come to order. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
As is customary, I'll ask each of the commission members to please identify themselves for the record, beginning with Commission Member Easterday, going around the table.
Good afternoon, Kristen Easterday.
Dawn Tyler Lee.
Marshall Moore.
Good afternoon, William Murdoch.
And I'm Chet Christie, I serve as Chair of the Commission. Before moving further, let me thank Commission Member Moore for whatever you needed to do to accommodate this afternoon's meeting. I know that presented a bit of a conflict, so thank you very much for that and for your ability to be here. Will staff who are present also identify themselves for the record, please?
Ken Paul, Council President Andy Ginther's office.
Rory McGinnis in the Mayor's office.
Greg Beaverson, Department of Human Resources.
Cheryl Austin, City Clerk's Office.
Angie Levin, City Clerk.
Outstanding, thank you all. And I don't believe that we have any guests present today. As we have done previously, I think it's appropriate that we briefly review the Commission's charge and a couple of the applicable provisions of the city charter. Section 15-1 of the Columbus City Charter provides that the salary of all elective officers provided for in this charter shall be established by ordinance upon recommendation from a Citizens Commission on elected officials' compensation. Section 15-3 indicates that the Commission shall conduct a review of salaries for like positions in the public sector. That review shall be made for the purpose of recommending salaries appropriate to the duties and responsibilities of each elective office for the city. And similarly, Section 15-4 provides that the Commission shall submit to the clerk, the city clerk, a report of recommendations for the salary of each elective officer of the city, including an annual cost of living adjustment, which shall not exceed the average increase in the Consumer Price Index or successor thereto during the preceding 4 years. Those three provisions of the Charter provide the foundation for the responsibilities and the scope of this Commission's charge. To date, the Commission has established benchmarks and developed a framework for our consideration of the data, the research, and other relevant information that will ultimately support our recommendations that are submitted to the Council for their consideration. We've completed, essentially staff has completed a fairly detailed salary survey of 29 peer cities and has conducted other independent research. The Commission has been fortunate to be able to participate in a video conference with our peer commission in Phoenix, Arizona, which provided significant insight into their established process and I believe provided some additional insight for us going forward. It's a process that's very involved, and has evolved to a very mature one over the past 16-year period. We've also received presentations from, a specific presentation on the CPI from one of our very well renowned and recognized local economists, Dr. William Lafayette, and subsequently received Dr. Lafayette's summary report of his presentation. Based on Dr. Lafayette's recommendations, the Commission has determined that the annual cost of living increase for all elected officials shall be equal to but not exceed the geometric average increase of the CPIU Midwest size Class A, all items. We have also determined that the Commission will set salaries for the mayor specifically in the year 2020 and for the council president, council members, city attorney, and city auditor beginning in 2018. We specifically adopted an outline as presented during our last meeting of our draft report, at least conceptually, and a framework for what that report will look like. Including today's meeting, we've held 7 meetings, including 2 public hearings. All of our meetings have been recorded and televised, and those meetings are available online as well. There has been established a dedicated webpage containing all of the materials, including all of the independent research and all of the salary data that has been obtained by staff. I believe that pretty much summarizes our progress to date. Are there other matters that I may have inadvertently failed to reference that commission members would suggest need to be incorporated as well? Okay, very good. In light of that then, everyone's had an opportunity to take a look at the minutes from our last meeting, our May the 19th minutes. Before requesting a motion, is there anything that anyone has seen that may have been omitted? Anything else that we need to correct or otherwise amend as far as the minutes are concerned?
I have one small amendment on the second page, third paragraph from the bottom. Commissioner Tyler Lee's name needs to be corrected. Thank you.
Very good, so noted. Got it, okay. I'm sure that happens more frequently than not. I just noticed that Commissioner Tyler Moore.
I didn't even.
You're saying you're so accustomed to it, you didn't even catch
I'm so
it.
used to it. Thank you,
Okay.
Commissioner Marshall Moore.
My
Very
pleasure.
All righty, with that noted amendment, I'll entertain a motion that we approve the minutes with the noted correction.
I'll make a motion.
Is there a second?
Second.
It's been properly moved and seconded that the minutes of the May 19th meeting with the appropriate amendment be approved. All in favor may show by the usual sign of aye.
Aye.
All opposed have the same right, nay. Ayes have it unanimously. Minutes are approved. During our last meeting, before we concluded the meeting, there was a request made by Commission Member Easterday to staff to provide some data, basically comparing the 29 peer cities' relationship between their general fund budget and the salaries for all of their elected officials. Believe that the review and assessment or evaluation of that information has been completed, and at this time we'll turn things over to Mr. Beaverson for your review of that information.
Mr. Chairman, good afternoon, Commissioners. We have more graphs for you today.
Imagine that.
Imagine that, I know. If I could turn your attention to the document titled Research Data Presentation Follow-Up, June 2015. And just as Chairman Christie was explaining, what we tried to do was, based on Commissioner Easterday's request, is take a look at the relationship between the general fund budget of each of the cities and look at the salaries that each of the elected officials were paid in relationship to that. The first table, the first page that you see there, that is the table, the rank ordered by general fund. These are fiscal year 2015 budgets. Columbus ranks number 11 on that list. I do want to point out that in this case and a few other cases with the charts, that we did not have data for a couple of the cities when it came to this information. And in this case, Cleveland and Atlanta were omitted from this. That's why you see only 28 cities instead of the 30 that were selected. On the next page, which would be page 3, you'll see the title of that particular graph is mayor salary as a percentage of general fund budget. And you can see there below, the established median for mayor salaries is 0.016% of the city budgets. The Columbus mayor is 0.021%. And I can roll through these. Please stop me if you have any questions. Next page, page 4, council member salary as a percentage of the general fund. The median is 0.007%, and the Columbus is 0.006%. And we want to make clear too that in this case, there's more than one person serving in that particular job. It's one salary, not all the salaries combined. Okay, the next page, page 5, the council president's salary as a percentage of the general fund budget. The median is 0.008%. Columbus is the same number, 0.008% of the general fund. Page 6, the city attorney as a percentage of the general fund budget. The median is 0.023%, and for Columbus, 0.020%. And then the last page and chart, page 7, the city auditor salary as a percentage of general fund budget. The median is 0.020%, and the City of Columbus auditor is the same amount, 0.020%. And I'm happy to entertain any questions or any discussion that you'd like to have on this.
One question. In regards to page 4, where we're talking about the council member salary, this included all types of full-time and part-time council members, I would assume?
That's correct.
Okay. Did we look at breaking it down into 2 separate categories, and if so, what did that look like?
That can be something that we can provide. The information that we have is here, though, at this point. If you would like us to do that, we can certainly provide that information. I think in the original, let's see, the original research, did we make I think we made a distinction, and I'm just going by memory here. We did not make a distinction, I don't believe. Yeah, they were all the same. Okay. So the first pieces of data that you would have received at the last meeting on council member base salaries, and then I think we did add some per capita income in there. That was all, that was both of them combined.
Okay. Maybe it would be helpful to break that down. And then I'm not sure if any of my fellow commissioners have any thoughts on maybe also looking at, I guess, the council president that way. That would also be a full-time versus part-time, and perhaps the mayor's position, and if there is a city manager accompanying that mayor or not, might be a way to look at it. I'm not sure if that would be helpful to anybody else.
That for the purposes of the mayor's discussion, we used the combined city manager and mayor
It
for
would have
these
been,
slides.
it would have been the same that we would have provided in the first one, because we used the same information. Well, actually, back on, be slide 6 from the, I'm sorry, I wasn't even
From
here.
our
It was
last
the May
meeting.
19th meeting. Yes, thank you. We have the mayor per capita base salary,
Then we have both. on-
but then 8, yeah, slide 8 is the mayor and city manager. I can go back and check the numbers and confirm whether this current one that I showed you is the mayor and city manager.
Okay.
But what we tried to do is, based on this request, whatever we did the first set, we wanted to obviously make this the same as the second set. It's just that I'm not sure what answer to provide you with right now. So let me confirm that.
Okay, thank you.
And, help Greg out, in that he wasn't here to hear the request last time, but part of the reason why this particular data set was presented was the request was, is there different data or a different group of numbers that you could use that would help identify a trend? In other words, one set of data was presented at the last meeting. We took another data point to see whether or not it would be consistent. We can continue to push through that, but in getting back this data set, we were assured that it is largely consistent with the data that was presented at the last meeting, just using a different set of numbers.
That's why I'm thinking it is indeed, it does combine both, but this title of the slide didn't say that, so I can't tell you for sure.
Okay.
So I need to go back and check
That's
that
great, thank
to make
you.
sure.
Before we move on to looking at any base recommendations, during our last meeting, I believe the request, and the minutes reflect, that a request was made to obtain the average increase for city employees for the last 5 years, and whether or not we had a projected increase for fiscal year 2015 already established, or what that is. I think we're a little early yet to have a projected increase for 16, but to the extent that we've been able to obtain that information, it would be very helpful to hear that as well.
We have information.
Yes. We did the information. We fulfilled the request. I don't think I have it in
Is that what you emailed?
Yeah.
I can
I
print
didn't
that
make
off.
a copy of it.
I'll bring that.
Okay. Great, thank you. And my apologies, I should have had that here with me, but we just didn't have it printed out.
And while we're asking other questions, I guess I would follow up from, I think it was 2 meetings ago, or maybe 1 meeting ago. We received some great information on median salaries within the city of Columbus, full and part-time employees, and then it was broken down for us by different groups of employees. One thing we were missing was the city of Columbus overall median salary. Were you guys able to receive that information? Do you know?
Yes, we do have that.
Okay.
And thanks to the miracles of modern technology, I was able to just pull up the answer to the last question. Hopefully with a similar pause in action, I can get the answer to that question. But the answer, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chair Christie, but the question was, what is the median Columbus employee pay raise for all employees over the past 5 years? From 2011 to 2015, it was 2.6%. And what is the median Columbus MCP employee pay raise over the past 5 years for the same period? And for the sake of discussion on why that would matter, the elected officials that we are contemplating today are under the MCP contract. So that would be included here. The average increase was 2.75% over that same period of time.
Thank you. And just by way of explanation, the MCP reflects employees who are not organized or not unionized. They're not represented by a union. So for all of those who are organized, that salary is determined on the basis of negotiations. For those who are exempt, it is not. So just wanted to take a look at all employees and then at the same time take a look at the exempt employees. 2.6% for all employees, 2.75 for MCP.
And just to clarify, that was 2.6 or 2.75 for each year? That was the average over 5 years?
Correct.
Okay.
we know if there was an established or a projected 2015 figure? Because that usually happens right around April or thereabouts. So-
For MCP, that would have been included. I believe it was the years 2011 through 2015.
Okay.
But for 2016, that has not been established. For,
Okay, got it.
let's see, we have 6 contracts. I believe for all of them but one, that would already be established, that future 2016 amount, which would have been negotiated during the last contract.
So luckily, I found it. So, and I apologize if it was not sent out via email before. We will make sure that it is, and that will become part of the official record of the commission. So to clarify, the numbers that you will get are for the Columbus region. Commissioner Easterday, you can appreciate this, and for Franklin County. It comes from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and they do not keep city-specific information for Columbus. And 2013 is the last year for which the data is currently available from this source. And the source referred to is from Columbus 2020. This is Young Kim, the Director of Research. The Columbus region per capita income in 2013 for all residents was $43,662. For Franklin County, it was a very similar amount, $43,506. 2013, $43,662 for the region, $43,506 for the county. That would include all residents regardless of profession, education. It's just flat out median income. We will present that same information.
Okay.
That was pretty quick on your part, Glenn.
Sorry, I forgot.
Thank you.
The first reference on the handout is to the definition of the term market. And let me just share briefly that during the period of time that I've served the city as a human resources director, because both the city administration and council, I believe, prided itself on ensuring that we were compensating all of our pay groups, bargaining unit, exempt and otherwise, fairly, equitably, and competitively with the market. We felt it an obligation to ensure that on a periodic basis, we were reviewing market competitiveness for all of our pay groups. And in order to do so, we engaged 2 or 3 over that period of time, employee benefits consultants and other compensation analysts. I believe it might have been Aon Hewitt and Associates, Watson and Wyatt, The Hay Group, very early on, was another entity that we've utilized in the past, in addition to a lot of the data that we contracted for, or that we obtained on that was web-based, that we would basically pay for a subscription on an annual basis. The purpose of that analysis was to determine whatever classification we were looking for, what would the median or market salary be for that classification in the specific peer group that we were reviewing. It might have been 15, 25, no definitive number, depending on the classification and how much information we really had at our disposal, how big the group was. But the bottom line is, we would always be looking at what's the median base salary for this particular classification. And once that was obtained, and Mr. Beaverson, you can correct me if my memory is off base here, you utilized a definition that I believe had been consistently utilized by entities like World at Work and other professional entities that did this for a living, that basically said that if your analysis indicated that the base pay was within 10% plus or minus of the median salary, then it would be considered to be within the range of what's considered to be market. That's an analysis that obviously is fairly limited in scope, but worked fairly well for us in that process. And I think that's certainly one of the criteria that we can begin to look at here. And it's something that's, I believe, fairly objective, that we can utilize on a fairly consistent basis in assessing at least the extent to which there may be some evidence. Among the variety of different things we can look at, that's certainly one of them. And I'm glad that we provided a definition so that we at least have something tangible to work with in terms of determining whether something's competitive, whether it's within market, et cetera. One of the reasons that I asked for the median pay raise over a period of time is so that we can look again consistently at what the city has been doing for basically all of our pay groups, all of its pay groups across the various job classifications, both exempt and bargaining unit, over a stated period of time, and potentially have that as in place as some type of an objective criteria, some type of a trend. And to be able to look at that among the other data as we approach making a determination as to where appropriate base salaries ought to be for each of our elected officials. I believe our data also suggests, at least an information that had been provided in a previous meeting, pretty much laid out where salary increases have been for not just our bargaining unit employees, not just our employees as an entire group, but specifically for our elected officials over a period spanning 2006 through 2017. And it looks like, with a few exceptions, that figure has fairly consistently been either 2 or 3%, with some exception. And just roughly looking at the math, if we look at 2006 through 2017, that averages, someone else can do the math, but it looks like it would be somewhere between like 3.5 and 4% as an overall average increase consistently through that period. You see a number of 3s, a number of 2%. Now, there are some outliers here, but overall, it looks like it's been fairly consistent. So I offer all of that just as part of the framework for our consideration as we go forward and look at all of the other data. And I'm certainly open to and welcome any other thoughts, any other approaches, that commission members may have in terms of how to go about dissecting and putting together all the information that's been provided to us, and an approach for landing on a recommendation. And certainly, in addition to any input or thoughts from commission members, we'd certainly welcome any additional input that staff has in terms of an approach, a methodology, et cetera. Let's start with commission members, because this is obviously a critically important task, but one that has a lot of moving pieces. So I'm open to any initial thoughts, any suggestions in terms of framework or approach from any of the other commission members as well. Does that pretty much mean that we'd like to hear a little bit more from staff? That's what I'm reading?
Yes.
Okay, fair enough. That in mind, let me turn things over to Mr. McGinnis, Mr. Paul, for any other suggestions or thoughts that you may have in terms of our approach.
I think only thing I would add, which would support what you just outlined there, and I think the approach that we've taken to the data to this point, with the caveat that the discussion of market or determining median for all city employees, generally speaking, are for administrative type jobs or service delivery jobs, either classified or unclassified, where comparing jobs from city to city is a bit easier in the sense that looking at specific tasks, the tasks themselves are relatively the same between cities, regardless of the size or population or reach, with some exception. That's why in the data presented at our last meeting, we took it a step further beyond just the median base pay for each of the elected officials, but looked at it as a median per capita pay, which was trying to take out of the equation the distinct differences perhaps of being the mayor of a city of 200,000 versus a city of 850,000. Certainly in the case of the city of Columbus, even looking at square mileage, regardless of population, and the vast expanse of delivery of services, it's different than providing services in other cities. But we simply carried forward that exact point you made, Chair Christie, of looking at the median and tried to level it out by equating it by population. And again, it's not perfect, and there are going to be variations. But that's the reason why I think we settled in on trying to present per capita.
Any additional thoughts?
If we move forward in the agenda and look at each individual office holder, I think that following the lead of the commission, if there are thoughts when looking at each respective office, certainly want to give commissioners the opportunity to weigh in on any thoughts as it applies to specific office holders as we talk through how they compare to the peer set. But yes, Chair, I think we do have notes and thoughts prepared to help guide a discussion through each of those elected offices, but want to be deferential to the commission and go through one by one.
Are you looking for I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, if I may, are you looking for a percentage recommendation? So a percentage increase for each group of elected officials?
Why don't we just review that real quick? So what we're looking at is, we're actually looking at a number, but that would be either a percentage increase or decrease, or it would stay the same. But it's an actual number for, the mayor would be for 2020, and for each other office holder would be an actual number for 2018. And then it would be the cost of living adjustments already been established how we would calculate that.
To Rory's point, and the trick of all of this, we have to define a number as a starting point for the salary. Of course, we all know that whatever that number is will be compared to the number in the prior year, and a percentage difference will be calculated, so it will be a percentage. The challenge is that each elected office holder makes a different amount, and a dollar increase for a lower amount will obviously, as a percentage base, be a much larger increase in terms of a percentage, even though the actual dollars might be very similar in nature. And as we go through each one of the elected offices, there's probably different considerations that are taking place for each. I know that in preparing my notes for today and being prepared for any questions you might ask, what I attempted to do is use the same analysis and formula and approach to analyzing the same data that's been presented to date for each of the elected office holders, rather than introduce any new data or use different ways or different approaches from looking at the salaries for different office holders, but to go from beginning to end with each office holder using the same sort of analysis to arrive at some sort of framework to at least provide a window for discussion to occur.
As we prepare for that discussion, can you remind me why the mayor's salary was flat from 2011 to 2015?
Best of my recollection, that was by election of the mayor. And a few of those years, MCP employees in particular, those who were not subject to collective bargaining, because of a very austere budget and because we were going through a significant downturn in the economy, we had employees basically taking zero increase at all. So in light of that, the mayor elected to do likewise.
Because he's the only one that's reflected to have been flat for 5 years.
Yeah. And thank you for drawing attention to this point. And actually, it was a point of conversation among staff for the past week, and I admittedly did not notice it. It's not wholly accurate. Essentially, this is derived from the ordinances that were passed. However, in practice, in the years preceding 2009, 2007, 2008, for certain, perhaps 2006, I need to go back and look. Each of the elected officials did a couple of different things. One, I know from a council perspective, while an ordinance was passed to set a pay rate that would be that increase, the council president and then subsequent, and it was a different council president at the time, and the council members at the time actually wrote a letter to the auditor declining their pay increases in those years. It reflected the budget reality of the time. To Director Christie's point, during that time there were actually furlough days put in place. There were a number of layoffs and significant budget costs across the board. And council members did not take those pay increases those years. And then even in ramping up in subsequent years, and we can get the actual letters and the correct history of it, it was a situation where when they did accept a pay increase, it wasn't at the full rate that was passed via ordinance. In other words, it reflected what the message at the time was: we were going to be restoring services, not overnight, but over time. And so likewise, I know at least from council's perspective, pay increases were taken gradually over time, not immediately the full rate that was passed by ordinance.
And you said that's not fully reflected in this
It is not,
document.
because what this reflects is the ordinance that was passed and what could have been realized or accepted by council. Differently, which is a separate approach to this, I know at least in the case of the city auditor, while that rate was accepted, a check was written back to the city in the amount of that increase. So similarly, the pay increase from the auditor, and I'd have to go back and check the records for the city attorney, but those pay increases were all, I believe, not accepted by any of the elected officials ahead of that 2009 point.
So just as one point of clarity, then for the mayor's salary from 11 to 15, that was flat by ordinance?
That's my understanding, and we may want to go back and
Okay.
check that, but I believe by ordinance that was chosen. And I think that was part and parcel to the fact that prior to 2008, this is one of the years that Director Christie was referring to, which would be an anomaly out of the norm of the sort of 2-3% increases. I was not involved in this. Greg may have been. Director Christie, you were here at the time, but I believe that there was a market study or survey that was less formal than this process to try and determine where the mayor's salary at the time was in line with other large city mayors. And there was a more significant increase in that year. That was an acceptance of we're not necessarily in line with our competitive set, and there needed to be a greater increase at that time. And then it was followed by what you might consider cost of living increases in the subsequent years following. It's an example of what happened prior to this commission being established, that from time to time, the elected leaders would, with the help of human resource staff internally, would go out and try and take an honest look at the market and provide some guidance as what was acceptable and appropriate at the time. If there was an adjustment that was needed, one was made, and then in subsequent years, really a focus on cost of living increases. And not to just focus on one elected official in that history, but a similar approach was taken, has been taken consistently by council and council members in the sense there are slightly larger increases over and above 3% in 2010 and 2011, and then again in 14 and 15. I can tell you from experience that as a focus on trying to, over time, close the gap that exists, and we'll get to that discussion later, but the gap still does exist between council-based pay and our peer set, and those slightly larger increases were a reflection of trying to, not all at once, but over time, try and close that gap. I should, for those who are at home watching or listening to this, the document that we're referring to, while not up on a PowerPoint today, is and has been available online since the first meeting that it was presented at, and still is today.
Other questions or clarification? Okay, then are we prepared to begin some initial discussion regarding the mayor's based salary recommendation? Okay. All minds are clear, let's proceed.
All right, well, we'll get comfortable. This is where the work gets tough, and thank you all again for agreeing to lead us through this process. We will start with the mayor, and as I referred to just a few minutes ago, all the elected officials in what I hope you will find to be a logical progression. If not, feel free to interject, ask questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. But just looking at the mayors and the data that's been presented to date, in terms of population, the city of Columbus, out of the 30 cities considered, ranks 5th in population. When considering cities with a strong mayor, Columbus ranks 3rd in mayoral pay out of the 22 cities that have a strong mayor. This gets to Commissioner Easterday's point of distinction between cities that have strong mayors or weak mayors, and then cities with city managers. And to that point, when considering cities who have a mayor and a city manager, Columbus ranks 12th out of 30. We spent the majority of the time in previous slides and data presented focusing on that data set. And the reason being is that the job of Columbus's mayor is certainly more than that of a ceremonial mayor. That said, we don't have a city manager, but the nearest comparison in terms of the powers granted to our mayor under the charter and being a strong mayor in a large city with exceptional executive authority, we felt it a fair comparison to include mayoral salary and city manager salary in comparison to our mayor's base salary. And that's where you get that combined rank. And when you rank our mayor in that context, again, we rank 12th out of the 30. That data seems to suggest that the mayor's salary is in line with the current peer set. Our further analysis, and we spoke about this again a moment ago, where we took population into account. And while the mayor's current salary ranks above the median salary for mayors and city managers combined, although not a great deal above, this is placed into greater context when we look at per capita median salary. And I know Commissioner Dawn Tyler Lee has the prior slides in front of her. That's great. If you refer to the slides that were presented at our last meeting, the approach follows that intentionally. But when you consider the median per capita salary for the mayor, Columbus is below the median for all cities studied. The median per capita for the peer set, again, all the city studies, is 25 cents per resident. Columbus per capita is 21 cents per resident. And Columbus ranks 19th out of 30 cities studied for per capita salary for the mayor. That ranks below all of the Ohio cities studied, just for greater context. And there is a cluster of group near the middle that Columbus falls in, where a good portion of those city studies fall. So following that logic, and you can agree or not to follow this logic, but again, it's to provide framework. If we wanted to provide an idea of, well, what if our mayor was paid at that median per capita rate, which we're below? If we took the median per capita or per resident salary cost of 25 cents per resident, and we multiplied that by the 822,553 residents that live in the city of Columbus, and I will note that we actually, according to updated census data, are larger than that and are the 13th fastest growing city in America. Thank you very much. But using 2010 census data, and that's what we've been using all along. The mayor's base rate at a median per capita of 25 cents per resident would be $205,638. So the current salary for the mayor is well below that at $172,981.
So the 2005 number would be the 2015 salary of the mayor, if it were consistent with this slide, okay.
The salary currently set, so the last salary you would be looking at before making a recommendation, the current salary for the mayor is set in 2019, and it's different than the other elected officers. The current salary set in 2019 is $191,871. So really the difference between what the per capita, based on the current median, and what the mayor's salary set for in 2019 is relatively close, but it's still less. It's $13,767 different, or 7% less. It's a lot of data to give you there, but if it's only one data set, but again, logically following the information that has been presented to this point. So, my personal conclusions in looking at that, roughly the mayor's salary is in line with peer cities and isn't significantly, and significantly is a subjective term, and I would leave that to the commission to determine what is significant and what is not, above or below the median per capita. It would seem to suggest that looking that we are below the median per capita, that certainly an upward adjustment would be warranted. If the first question is, would we have a rational basis to make any recommendation for increase? I think you can make a logical argument to say yes. Determining what that amount would be, or what dollar amount or percentage, it would probably be a relatively modest increase. But again, that's really for further discussion. But in the sense that we are not far out of line with our peer set, either above or below. If the intent was looking out 5 years into the future, which is unfortunately the task that you're charged with, a modest increase into the future certainly would be warranted, if for no other reason, to keep pace with the peer set. Not necessarily looking to pick up any ground, but if we were simply looking to maintain the current position in comparison to our competitive set. I think at this point, I would turn it back over to commissioners to allow for some dialogue and discussion. The only other caveat to offer, and it applies to all of the elected officials we'll discuss today, but one, the recommendation is only for the base. In the case of this particular recommendation for the mayor, that point is less important because you're setting the base for 1 year, and we've already determined what the increase for cost of living will be, but that cost of living increase will only be for 1 year. The 2018 commission that will meet will have the benefit of setting the base for 22 and then 3 subsequent years. That is different in this context. In addition, just a reminder, the recommendation is the cap or ceiling. So whatever the recommendation might be, it still requires council action in consultation, presumably with the mayor, to determine whether or not whatever the recommendation is should be fully realized or implemented. Certainly, we cannot go above that recommendation. And again, it requires council action, regardless of what the recommendation is. It's a lot of data, a lot of numbers to go through. We'd be happy to go over any of them that I went through too quickly, or if you would like me to refine them and answer any questions, I'll turn it back over to the commission.
I have a question.
Mhm.
Thank you for that. I appreciate the analysis. So we have currently the mayor's salary, that's the one we're discussing now, at 172 roughly, and it would go up to 205 today were we to make this adjustment. Did you do a calculation after 2020, maybe with a 3% increase, which is what seems to be the standard, and let us know what that number would look like?
A
Projected.
3% increase over the 2019 rate.
Over the 2000, I was asking for the 3% average increase over the 205,000 salary, because that's what we have for 15.
Correct.
But we're asked to set for 2020. I'd like to know what that number looks like in 2020. And I do it myself on my phone if I was
Sure.
mathematically astute. But I'm afraid that I will come up with a number that is not correct.
205, yeah, so,
638, 205, 638, that number?
correct.
Yes. What that number looks like with a 3% increase in 2020.
2021.
But for each
Excuse
year.
me,
each year.
for each year.
Yeah, so compounded.
So-
Yeah,
3%.
16,
Yes,
17, 18,
yes,
19.
yes.
Yeah. I did not do that, to answer your question. The only thing I did do
3%
was a-
beyond
was a 3,
638
Yes.
each year.
Even though I think we've already made a decision, we're not gonna set for those years. I wanna know what
Sure.
the 2020 number would be.
Sure.
Yeah.
The only
And it'd be
numbers
nice to know what percentage increase that would be over the already set salary of 2019.
so I do know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So 3% over the current set salary for 2019 is 197,627, which, to your point of why you've asked the question, is still less than.
And I actually
It's
want
less
the
than-
3% over the number that Mr. Beaverson is calculating now. I would like to know what that looks like.
We're doing math, and further to help explain the logic, if there is any. part of the reason why the focus of the median per capita was it is something that has carried through our discussions to this point and is a way to take population out of the equation. And if the goal was for the recommendation to simply keep Columbus in a safe, reasonable, conservative path of being in the middle of our peer set, it seemed like it, at the very least, a large logical way to get to a starting point for a number. Whether that number was beginning, middle, or end of whatever the conversation was, at least it was a way of getting at some number for the commission, which really, when you're talking about setting a dollar amount for compensation, really finding that starting point is a difficult task.
Let me, at this juncture, before we even hear that number, just share a concern or something we at least need to be cognizant of as we're proceeding with our deliberation. I'm a little bit concerned about the use of a per capita standard, as it may have implications for collective bargaining going forward, but particularly as it relates to our safety forces. Without getting into all of the specific details, our safety forces have typically looked at the surrounding or the central Ohio area in terms of looking at police officer salaries, which when you look at all of our all of our suburbs, specifically Bexley, Dublin, Arlington, Westerville, many of those salaries are fairly comparable to what a police officer in the city of Columbus makes. Columbus is probably, if my recollection serves me correctly, still at or near the top of the list in terms of all of the surrounding communities, as it should be. If we start looking at a per capita calculation for salaries as it relates to our safety forces, and we establish that as a precedent going forward, I'm a bit concerned about the implications it may have the next time we return to the bargaining table, because that's never been a standard, that's a standard we've attempted to avoid on an ongoing basis for the obvious reasons. If you look at comparing salaries in Bexley, or the population of Bexley versus what a per capita would look like in Columbus, suffice it to say, it would have significant implications for what may be bargained at the table for police officers and firefighters, for that matter, in Columbus versus the other surrounding communities. So I just think we need to be very mindful that what we do in this setting isn't done in a vacuum, and it does have implications for what we're going to do going forward, and potentially has implications for what the city and its future administrations may be faced with when we sit at the collective bargaining table. And I just would caution us to be very, very careful about using a per capita approach to the establishment of base salaries because of its potential implications in other settings. Just an observation.
Just for purposes of clarification, it was part of the reason why I wanted to provide the logic behind that. Again, it's largely to provide a context for discussion and a starting point, not to in any way suggest that that is, in fact, the formula that the commission would use, but to help arise at some place
Sure.
to begin the conversation.
Certainly.
So for instance, we could do the same calculation with the second set of information that you provided this week based on the general fund.
Yeah. It may be harder because as a percentage of general fund is a little bit different, but I think that with the help of Greg, we could work through that. the same exercise is done for, I've done that, prepared to do that for each of the other elected offices. Again, just to have a similar analysis for each of the four for purposes of discussion.
I guess I want to make sure that we also continue to look at the analysis that's been done based on median salary, as opposed to based on median per capita base pay. The two have very different results in terms of where Columbus is and our relationship to median or the market. So as we go through the process, I want to make sure that we keep all of it in context.
To the chair's point, looking back to prior data sets, if just looking at the mayor singularly, the median salary is 122,400 for all the cities combined. Keep in mind that is the mayor singularly and not the mayor combined with the city manager.
Do you have the city manager?
The median for city manager and mayor combined is 137,616. And for those following at home, there is, to the chair's point, a very distinct difference when you look at median versus median per capita. And those joining us at meeting 7, at the first meeting or the second, there was continued conversation, but we established a peer group of cities, which can be referenced online, but there is a significant difference between the 30 cities that we've contemplated in terms of size and scope of responsibility. And the chair is very well advised to encourage us to consider that median per capita may not be an effective way to look at this. That is why it was presented, to try and bring some way of closing the gap between smaller cities and larger cities.
We
We have a number.
You know what, now I'm like, well, maybe we're not gonna use that data set.
Yeah.
So I feel bad that you've been on this assignment for the last 10 minutes. Yeah, honestly, I don't know if we need it, if we don't think that that's the appropriate way to look at the salary. I think our time would be well spent if we could find or agree upon the appropriate metric or the appropriate way to look at the salary, and then it's just a mathematical problem for each. I actually like per capita, but respect your analysis for why that may not be the best way to evaluate the compensation. But if we can come to an agreement as to what is the best way, and then again, it's just math.
Very, very true. Commissioner Murdoch.
Mr. Chair, if I can, I want to make sure we're thanking Mr. Paul for taking on the unenviable task of giving us a starting point, as uncomfortable as that might be. I thought the analysis was fair and really helpful. I think the task before us is interesting because we have all of this data, and I believe it's our charge to keep it in context of, is each salary fair within the context of those data points. And so looking at it, we have per capita numbers that tell us maybe we're a little low. We have other numbers, median salaries, that maybe we're a little high. We have data that I was looking at within the region that Morpsey had provided, where we're still in the ballpark of what a top-tier community city manager might make with the mayor's salary. what I'm getting at is, I think that we've got a lot of different signposts we could use, a lot of different data, but the number that we have projected for 2019, if we were to add the cost of living increase, would still be in the general ballpark of the middle of that. So I think that's, if we wanted to be very conservative on this, we actually have a pretty decent number that falls somewhere within the middle of a lot of these different ranges. That said, doing so in context of the employees is important, I think. Doing so in context of even the median income and the region is something we may want to think about. So it might be helpful to look for a simple way to determine if we need to make an increase. And I guess the one thing that sticks out to me that could be interesting to look at for discussion is looking at the median income for Columbus or Franklin County and certain multiples of that, and as a benchmark. I'm comfortable with the data showing us that we're at least somewhere in the ballpark of the middle. From there, I think this is one of the more difficult jobs, and I think it should be compensated fairly and appropriately. So I think a raise within context would make a lot of sense. But thanks to the staff for giving us the data to show us that we're kind of close for what that's worth.
That's great. I appreciate each of the points that you've made. And you've suggested a couple of different ways. Looking at the 2019 figure in the context of median salaries for Columbus and Franklin County, looking at it from the standpoint of whether or not that figure essentially has us somewhere in the middle, somewhere close to what market suggests, and also looking at it in the context of other employee group raises that have occurred over a period of time in order for there to be some level of fairness and equity. Is there a particular preference, or do other commission members have similar thoughts, other thoughts on the other criteria that you may want to use in determining what that bump in salary should be from the 2019 figure? Or is there any follow-up from what Commissioner Member Murdoch has just shared? Any other thoughts along those lines or otherwise?
I would say everything that you said made a lot of sense, so I agree.
Chair Christie, I don't know if this will help or hurt the consideration of all of that. The Charter Review Commission and in the charter and trying to help provide some semblance of context, although the direction was less specific to allow the process to evolve. There is a statement where, and it was deliberate in some regards, I expect, where the duty of the commission, this commission, was to make comparisons to public salaries. In other words, there could have been specific instruction to also consider private sector and public salary positions. That would have allowed for and entered into the fray of comparing CEOs or executives of companies to public officials, which we could do. I say that only for the sense of to provide a little greater context in terms of sort of the parameters of looking at it to help guide and find which of those different ways of looking at it you might consider. Certainly looking at the median income of the city, of the county, of the region is important for context. Just to have a good feel about what the recommendation you're making, though it's not necessarily a part and parcel to the comparison of public sector salaries, in the sense that that median includes public and private sector salaries across the gamut of employment, ranging from professional and non-professional jobs, regardless of education and all those other factors.
Well, we do have a significant amount of data that is specific to the public sector that's here. And in that context, I think to Commissioner Murdoch's point, that data does give us a pretty good sense that we're not far off the mark in terms of how we're compensating our elected officials. So certainly appreciate the point you're making in terms of maybe utilizing the median income for all of Columbus and Franklin County. Granted, our focus should be far more so on the public sector as per our charge. But even with that, I think we're probably not very far off the mark.
Mr.
Please.
Chair, just for clarification, I was not suggesting that we use the median income as the level for the salary, but I was looking at ways to give us an approach, so multiples of median income or something like that, to give us another signpost. But just wanted it on the record that I was not recommending a $130,000 decrease for the mayor.
Right. Yeah, we'll make
Please.
sure that that's abundantly
Yeah,
clear
make
for
sure
the
that's in the
record.
minutes.
Stick to that because I didn't want to seem overly critical. That would have been,
Yeah.
I don't think anyone interpreted his comments in that
Wanted to be
fashion.
clear for the record.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Okay. Other other thoughts, commission members, about anything that we've discussed so far?
If the average MCP increase from 2011 to 2015 was 2.75%, and the typical increase, give or take, is usually about 3%. Seems like a 3% increase would be reasonable and fair.
Other thoughts? I tend to agree with the position that you're taking.
I have a thought. I agree that going forward, the kind of 3% is a really good benchmark, but I am concerned and would like a little more dialogue around whether the 2019 salary is fair and appropriate, even though we're not going to change it. I feel very strongly about fair compensation, and I don't want to build upon an unfair base. So I'd like to, even though, again, we've agreed to, that has been set, I wouldn't feel comfortable just adding 3% on that, because I'm not confident that that's a fair base salary for 2019.
Okay.
So now, Mr. Beaverson, I want to hear the number. even though we're not going to use it, for purposes of context, you've done the work. Yeah, I'd like to hear what that number would be.
Okay. Okay. In the scenario that you asked about, in 2015, if the salary were to be changed to $205,638, compounded 3% every year to the year 2020, the salary in 2020 would be $238,389. And then, of course, we have all of those different ones each year if you would like to have that as well.
Thank you very much.
You're very
That's
welcome.
very good context.
just,
May I ask a question before you move?
Sure.
What does that represent in terms of an increase over the existing 2019?
Over the existing.
Over the 191, 871?
The increase is 7.2%.
the 238 number?
From the 191 to 2005 is
To
7.2%.
205,638.
No, I'm asking what does it represent from the 191?
That is a 20.6% increase.
Thank you.
That's a big.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that would be based on per capita exclusively?
Yes.
And, okay.
It's just, and that's just to give some context, which I think is still helpful.
And regardless, to your point, regardless of whether we throw that out the window, if we want to create a window 3% above what the current 2019 salary is 197,627. So if you had a beginning and an end point of what's just 3% more than what is currently set and what we've calculated per capita compounded 3%, there's your sort of window frame of reference.
Mr. Chair, do you think, back to the discussion we had about the market rate and plus or minus 10%, is there any thinking around if we're looking to establish the top end of that window to be at 10%, I mean, that would take us 191 plus 10 is 218 or something like that.
Well, I think,
As a human resources professional, would you have approached
well,
that?
I think the context would be 10% over what happens to be the median, not necessarily 10% over the existing 2019 salary. Right. In order for it to be considered market.
And Mr. Chairman, if I may, the reason that plus or minus 10% is set in there when you're looking at quote unquote the market, what market pay is because when you do that research, the job or group of jobs you're looking to make that comparison with, pardon me, are never going to be exactly what the median is. So the question has come up, well, how much above or below are we going to establish kind of a window or, you know, what we call a competitive range? And in general compensation practice, it's plus or minus 10% on either side.
Going back to Commissioner Moore's concern about the 2019 number perhaps not being the appropriate base, and then Chair Christie's comment about using per capita, is there value in figuring out what the mayor's salary would have been in 12 through 15 if he had taken the increases and it had not remained stagnant at the 172, and then doing the math from there? So 2012, 13, 14, and 15 would be the numbers that they would have been had he not declined that raise, and then do the math out to 2019, and then the 3% increase from there. Is that sensible?
Because I think that's why we're potentially playing so much catch-up. That's a long gap to take no raise.
I don't know if those numbers are available now or not, but
We can make
is that a consideration? Because because we have the percentages down here, right? What, no, the percentages are what they were now. Okay. That would be perhaps a number to consider.
Commissioners, we're doing those calculations for you, but we'll get it done a little quicker. Just had to take off to his computer.
Sure.
I mean, he's going to do us some Excel magic with that, which we all love.
And that was, you were suggesting that was 3% each time?
Well, I'm not sure if he declined a 3% increase or if it was a different number. I don't know.
So do we know what he yeah.
I can
do.
confirm that. I knew somewhere here, I had done some research on that. I actually had the ordinance numbers and amendment numbers. That came directly from the ordinance. So whether it was declined or accepted, we don't actually have that information here in front of us, which I think is what Mr. Paul was saying earlier, is that we would have to go and find that for you. But the information that you have in this document is what appeared in the management compensation plan ordinance for each of those years, well, for 1 year, and then it's amended every year after that.
since we're waiting for math to occur, I can tell you that for years past 2011, with certainty, those numbers reflect actual acceptance of increases. So to Mr. Beaverson's point, those 0% were by ordinance following the prior increase in catch-up on the part of the mayor, essentially stating affirmatively via ordinance that did not want a pay increase in those years. Whereas prior to that, the election to decline pay raises was not by ordinance.
I would just say, looking at this comparison of municipal elected official compensation chart, even though I think it further exacerbates why maybe using a per capita number or metric, even though no one's suggesting that we should, but why that's skews the numbers quite a bit, because when you look at it, only 2 mayors out of our data set make more than the Columbus City mayor. So if you use the per capita math, it seems like there's this big gap that needs to be filled, but when you look at the actual salaries, only the mayor of Atlanta and the mayor of Seattle make more than our mayor. So I just think that's very interesting. It's back to your initial observation. We're much closer maybe than it looked using that data set.
Yep.
If I can too, one of the things that we have the benefit of is we've got an established COLA. And looking at the data, it seems like more often than not, most cities don't tie it to cost of living. Is that a fair statement to make? That most don't have an established cost of living increase?
In this case, cost of living is taken into consideration, I believe. But it's not as specific as what the commission is charged with.
There is a specific formula.
Correct, yes. It's one of the factors, I believe, when those decisions are made.
So this might go back to your original thoughts of, but the 3% above the 191, if we don't think that, if we're totally out of line
Mm-hmm.
With peer cities.
yeah.
Right.
I'd be comfortable if we're establishing that window, if that's the minimum increase that we'd be willing to accept. So it's just, do we want to go higher than, what was the number, 197?
Higher than 197,
Yeah.
yes.
Good point, because as I think Ken said at the beginning, what we're setting is the
It's
max.
the ceiling.
Yeah, the ceiling, so.
All right. Is there any concern about looking historically for annual increases range from 0 to 9%? Is that anything that the commission thinks that we should look at in terms of establishing a maximum? I mean, 1 year, I can't find it. 1 year it was 9, or a couple years it was a 9% increase for some of the offices. I mean, regardless of the numbers that we get, since 191 is already established by ordinance, anything that we pick will be viewed as a percentage increase over that.
Looking at maybe trying to do the quick math here, it looks like, you look at all of the average increases over that period of time. I don't know, well, there may be another question that we're asking for a computation here. I don't think that the increases exceed in the aggregate or I should say, the average increase exceeds about 4%. Looking roughly at all the numbers going from '06 to '17. And if we want to look at it strictly from the mayor's standpoint, looks like it's essentially been 3% or 0% with the exception of the 1 year in 2008.
To your point, and actually to Commissioner Easter's point of looking at a 4-year period, you're correct, Director Christie. The challenge becomes that these are compounding increases in each of those years, and we're only in the position of setting base pay for the first year, and the only increase will be based on actual inflation. So part of the way of looking at it is percent change from year one of a 4-year period. So the salary in that first year, that 4-year period, because essentially what we're talking about, aside from the mayor, this will be more applicable to the other 3 conversations, a 4-year period in which your percent change is. I believe the largest one came in 2008 to 2011, which I'm going from memory, but I believe the percent change from year 1 of that to year 4 of that was 19%. And council is actually in the midst of one currently that's not yet complete, that doesn't, but if you look at 2014, where there's a 5% increase in year 1, 5% in 15, 3 and 3 in 2017, I believe that's a 17% change from year 1 to year 4. Normally, you wouldn't look at that in context. You would look at year over year percent change. Mathematically, though, those percent changes compound because it's 3% on the year prior. Since you're setting pay for a 4-year period, one way of looking at it is percent change in year 4 over year 1.
Does anyone recollect what the average CPI change has been over the period of time? I mean, I know we have Dr. Lafayette's reports here.
1.99% for the preceding 4 years today. So if you were looking at using the CPI for the past 4 years, give no raise, but just except for adjusting for inflation, that would be 1.99%.
Thanks, Mr. Diamond. We have some information for you. Again, just to make sure we had this scenario right, starting on the year 2011, if the mayor's salary had been increased by 3% in 2012, what would that be? And then through 2019, is that correct? Would you like to have all of these or just what it would be in 2019? 2019, okay. In 2019, what it would be is $219,127. And I know what your next question is going to be.
3%.
Well, that, yeah, for 2020, that amount is $225,700. No, I thought you would ask, and we can.
Percentage increase.
Yeah, the percentage difference between the current 2019 and that 2019, are you getting that?
Oops. It's, and that's the, between 2019 and 2012? Is that what you're saying, Greg?
Uh, No, the.
2019 and 191.
Right.
In 191, okay.
Yeah.
I think it's 12%. I'll say, I said, I think I have it, but I won't say that loud.
Say that loud, so they got a 12%.
I was a political science major.
What was the question asked?
The percent, I think it was the percent difference between the 191 in 2019 and the 225.
14.
Right.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Let's repeat that. Yeah.
I think the question was the percent difference between the 219, 127 and the 191, 871, right? Yeah, yeah, okay.
Not sure if we'd want to make it more complicated, but if that is a set way that we are interested in looking at, perhaps we could look at, instead of 3% for each year, looking at 2012, it looks like 2 of the positions received a 2% increase and 2 received a 3% increase. So we could look at what's the average for each year instead of taking it 3% across the board. So for instance, in 2012, increasing it by 2.5%. Same thing with 2013. 2014, it would be 4. 2015, it would be 4. 2016, 3. But I'm not sure if that's, if this is a,
Can you say that one more time?
to just
You're
look
taking
at
the
the average, instead of
of
taking,
all of the elected officials, raises in each year?
yeah.
Two point five, 12, 2.5 and 13, 4 and 14, and 4 and 15. Gets us almost to the same place. Not exactly, but
What'd you say?
I said it gets us
It probably would be
almost to the same
similar,
place.
but
Okay.
Because it's like 2.5 in each of the first 2 years and then 4 in the latter 2.
It probably would be very similar.
Okay.
But again, I think we're going back to the same question that I think we brought up, is that 191 on par, is it fair? Looking at that base. Are we out of, do we need to catch up somehow, or?
I think the one thing we do know is approximately where we are in 2015 and how that equates to, we have a dollar figure for median salary and we have a dollar figure for median per capita base pay. And we know that in terms of median salary, that the 2015 figure, 172, has us in a place that is above the median salary for peer cities. And within that 10% above or below median salary, which would indicate that it is competitive with the market, the 172 figure that is. And assuming that that's accurate, that it is in fact competitive with the market, the calculations that have been done to get us to 2019 has been an average of 3% each year. So that's the context in which we have to determine whether or not the 191 figure seems fair, equitable, reasonable, competitive with the market. And I guess the question then is whether or not those 3% increases have been reasonable. Are they fair? Are they consistent with the market? Do we know whether or not increases of approximately 3% have been fairly consistent with or out of the norm for the public sector over that period of time between well, we don't know, obviously, what's going to happen in the future, but have they, over the last 2 years, 3 years, or if you have a projection into the future, does that 3% figure appear to be consistent with how classifications like this have been paid?
I do have data that explains, over the past X number of years, what the average salary increase for very broad groups of employees has been. And this is from World at Work, which is the international compensation association that has that certified me. The information is not broken down to specific public sector and private sector employees, but we do have the data for, in this case, it would be an exempt salaried employee, overtime exempt, FLSA overtime exempt. We can also look at data for executives. Can't remember the other word that's thrown in there. Executives, but CEOs basically, leaders of their organizations. Testing my memory here just a little bit, but on average, when the recession was here, obviously those annual pay increases went down across the board, public and private sector. It has gradually crept up over the past 4 or 5 years. We're just now getting back to the point where it's about an average of about 3% per year. I can get you this data. Of course, it would only be obviously up to this year, and that would only be projected because the data that was provided last year. What are you planning on doing in 2015? So it'd be projected for 2015. But on average, for that group of employees, salaried exempt employees, it's been about 3% annual increases. So I think, to answer your question, Mr. Chairman, I think you would be quite safe and quite fair and equitable in doing something in about that 3% area, based on that data.
And I guess the question really was to get to the point being raised by several commissioners is whether arriving at that 191 figure, whether that's been done fairly and equitably. And if it appears that 3% has been the percentage that's been used to get us there from 2015 forward. Because the ultimate question that was being raised is, was the 191,871 figure a fair figure? Does it truly reflect what compensation should be for the mayor? And it sounds as though, based on what you're sharing, that we're not far off the mark in using that 3% figure to get us to where it's projected to be in 19.
Correct, I would agree with that 100%.
And again, to Commissioner Murdoch's point, that 3% would be a base as opposed to the ceiling for our consideration. Okay. Do we have any thoughts in terms of that ceiling? Because I think that's ultimately where we're going to need to go. And what we use as kind of the barometer or the guidepost for going forward.
It helps. I think we've thrown out a lot of numbers, but the floor being 3% on to what the mayor, the current salary set is, again, 197,627. Through all the math that we've just contemplated, had 3% increases been awarded each of those years that were zero, the 3% increase, well, we would be at 219,127 in 19. 3% onto that would be 225,700, I believe. So the I believe the answer to your question is the floor, if we're using that context, is 197,627. The ceiling, 225,700.
I feel good about that. I'll just go
Repeat the floor
go on
until-
the record as saying that.
The floor, 197,627.
Okay.
The ceiling, 225,700.
For 2020.
Yeah.
So wait, that's 3% of 191?
3% of 191 is 197,627.
I have 196. 859.
Oh, Lori.
I'm sorry. But just a question, but aren't we putting one number in that field?
That's all we're doing. We're establishing.
We're not,
Right, we're not giving a range. We're
giving the ceiling number.
Right, we're doing this
We're just
ceiling
trying to
number.
get that conversation down to a
Right.
point where
Right. And that ceiling number represents a 14% increase.
197,627.
That's pretty high.
It's pretty significant, a 14% increase over the 197 number, over the 191 number, I'm
That
sorry.
would probably put us number one on this list
Right,
by
which-
far.
Yeah.
But I guess my thinking about that goes to an earlier point that, the current mayor took an admirable step in not taking a raise. And so by keeping the 172,981 the same from 2011 to 2015, you then in some ways are penalizing the person who will be mayor in 2020 for a good thing that our current mayor did. And so the question, I guess we have to debate as a commission is, how do we feel about that?
Well, but I think we need to look at it point well taken. I think we need to look at it though in the context again of today, where is it compared to the market? And the actions taken, although I think tremendous in terms of its overall value to the budget and extremely conscientious on the part of our current mayor, did that in fact result in a salary that was below market? And the figures that we have, at least in terms of median salary, suggest that it did not.
Mr. Beaverson, in the 2015 number, if the mayor had taken the raises, what would his salary have been this year, in 2015? You may have given it, I don't write it down.
No, I don't believe it did.
Okay.
That amount for 2015 would be 194,691.
So that would make the mayor the highest paid mayor in our data set.
Correct.
And I don't know that that's what we're trying to accomplish. I want fair compensation, but I don't know that we want, or striving, or if that's even fair. So that's good information to have. So your point is well taken. It's hard to understand how that didn't have that impact and make the salary less competitive, but the numbers aren't ferreting that out.
Challenge being, there was some analysis obviously done to set that pay rate to begin with. In advance of that, what data set was used to arrive at that may have been very different than the data set that we're using today.
Okay. I think we have a floor. The question is how we arrive at our ceiling. And what percentage reasonably drives that.
Can I ask one clarifying question? When you were talking about the averages just a few minutes ago, about 3%, you said that included median salary for public and private sector you were talking about?
Yes, it includes both.
About
It's-
3%.
Yes, ma'am. It's everyone who contributes to that survey. It would be a combination of public and private sector. We actually participate in that survey as well.
Okay. So that would, just to kind of talk out loud for a second, when we were talking about Franklin County and the regional per capita median salary, both were about 43,500. That's our average citizen.
Okay.
And they've been receiving 3% increases over the past few years.
No, the way that World at Work runs the salary survey, and by the way, it's not just them, other consultants and organizations run these surveys as well. The way that they do it is they group it up by different types of employees. So we can't make the assumption that all Franklin County citizens, for example, are exempt salaried employees. In fact, that is probably not the case. So there would be a different percentage increase on average for hourly non-exempt employees. In other words, people who get hourly pay and are paid overtime.
Okay.
Yeah. So again, different employee groups. If I remember correctly, again, my apologies, I'm just going by memory here. From that report, I think they group it up into 4, maybe 5 different employee groups.
Can I just bring that up, because I'm trying to look at this in 2 different ways. Number one, we want to be competitive, and we've talked about that, because these are important positions we're talking about, and we want the best qualified people in these positions. I don't think any of us disagree with that. But on the other hand, we're also thinking about the people who are paying the salary, and what do they look like, and are they able to give, are they getting those same increases so they can give back to taxes so that it can kind of make the world go round? So I'm kind of looking at it with 2 different lenses in that sense.
Given the fact that the CPI places a very specific limitation on the increases that will occur for the year subsequent to 2019, it probably makes a 3% increase in solely that. Obviously, something that's over the next 4-year period, it's somewhat diminished. It's not the equivalent of a 3% increase each year beyond, because we're limited by the CPI, if I'm making sense there. So maybe that necessitates having the 2020 figure just somewhat higher than that 3% in order to accommodate for the CPI limitations in the subsequent years. Is that a fair assumption or no?
That was essentially the point I was trying to make, and I don't think I did it very well by looking at the 4-year percent change. Because when you have annualized increases above CPI, it's compounding, and you get those in each of those years, but you will not have that in this case. It's only the base and then only inflation thereon. So if you look at that same 4-year period, without the compounding increases and the scheduled increases above CPI in each successive year, you run the risk of, all things being equal, the market getting ahead of you.
And with being a CPI being 1.9, thereabouts.
Currently for the past 4 years,
Right.
yes.
Economy doing fairly well, but we're not guaranteed anything going down the road. What would an increase of 5% followed by the knowing that there are limitations with the CPI, where would 5% put us in 2020?
5% on the current 2019 rate, not the one we calculated, would be $201,000 for 65. Double check my math since we've got so many calculators, but
Yeah, 201,465 and 55 cents.
yes.
And if you add the 1.9 for the out years, what does that make the average increase over that period?
It's A lot of math for a poli-sci major.
And you see the English major has her calculator down.
Absolutely.
Mr. Chair, while we're calculating that, I think even though I know we've got a lot of factors at play here, just knowing that the 2019 number is already set, considering a percent that articulates cleanly and prudently, it seems like a 5 or 6% would be something that we might want to consider. Just because to the average citizen's point, a 5 or 6% adjustment seems within the base of reason, for what it's worth.
Mhm. I agree wholeheartedly. That's why we needed a starting point. We're going to throw that number out because it appears fair and consistent. And I think the hard part was assessing to what extent the figure that's established in 2019 was a good one that was fair and competitive. And I think it took us a while to hash through that. So,
So, in answer to the question, Commissioner.
More. A 5% increase, and I hope someone's checking my math there. A 5% increase over the 2019 set rate gets you a rate in 2020 of $2,001,465. If we were to apply, which we don't know for certain, but the variations are going to be relatively small, I think, the 1.99% CPI increase, that gets you to a fixed dollar amount of $205,474 in 2021. Greg, did you do some math?
I didn't, because I didn't quite understand what was being asked, so I kind of laid off there, but I followed.
So the percent change, and this is over 2 years in this instance, from the current 2019 rate and what would be realized in 2021 would be 7%. If you divided that by 2, because it's over a 2-year period, that would be a 3.5% increase over 2 years. That would be similar to how these types of multi-year increases in collective bargaining contracts are referred to, where you have 2 in year 1 and then 3 and 3. They mix them together and divide by 3.
and fairly consistent with how increases have been provided over a period of time dating back several years.
So 5% gets us a little bit higher
Than the 3.
than the 3.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe like a 4.75.
Pardon?
Maybe a 4.75% increase would get us closer to the 3. But we don't have to do that
Yeah.
math. We could do that another time. I know we are.
Five, but that 5% figure, at least from my perspective, seems fair. Like,
And ultimately, if council and the mayor disagree, again, that's the ceiling that the commission's granting them.
okay. Other thoughts, commission members, based on what we've just heard? I'm asking other thoughts in terms of us landing on that 5% figure, and what the comfort level would be at this point.
I don't think I'm prepared to vote on it.
Okay.
There's just been so much data presented today. We do have another meeting scheduled, don't we? I need to think about it. Only just because there's just too much. I'm not prepared to vote on it. And we're actually out of time for this meeting, so.
It's at 3. That's what we anticipated we would give us about a 2-hour period of time.
Yeah.
Okay. Purposes of the meeting on the 4th, though. I mean, this was arduous, but necessary. And I think we have a pretty good framework for going forward. And obviously, we'll have to give some additional thought to the actual percentages. but I think a lot of our work is done in term, not, I don't use the term is done. I think we've boiled this pot a little bit more than when we started with, and we're closer to a stew now than we started out with. And maybe we can use the same approach in looking at each of the other elected offices. Obviously, where there's a need for some variation, I'm sure that staff will offer their thoughts and recommendations in terms of what those variations ought to be. But I want to echo some of what I've heard from Commissioner Murdoch. If we have a formulary, if we will, that we think works and works fairly well for us, based on all of the considerations, hopefully we'll be able to apply those to each of these elective offices and make the next process or the next meeting somewhat more abbreviated. And I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't take the time necessary. Obviously, this is very important, and we need to take whatever time we need to get through it. But I think we did a lot today to kind of hash through where we need to be.
Mr. Chair, I throw this out for discussion. So, in coming into this meeting, there's a certain leap of faith of trying to take a logical progression that I personally, or we think is logical in presenting information, not knowing if you will agree. We worked through that process with one elected official. I used the same process for the others. We had some variations in dialogue that could also be incorporated with the other electeds. There is the option, because a considerable amount of that work has already been done, because I was trying to be prepared for today's conversation. We could start, because you've sort of endorsed sort of that framework, we could build that out to at least have a starting point for discussion for each of those elected officials prior to the next meeting, which might make, I think it's still going to require every bit as much of a dialogue. But if interested, between now and the next meeting, we could use a similar approach to work out that framework for you if it's valuable.
I guess what would be valuable from my perspective would be an understanding of what approach we're actually going to take. Like, I think that we've, for a multitude of reasons, have looked at what the per capita base salary would net us, and I think I'm hearing that may be a bit problematic, looking purely at that. For obvious reasons that we've looked at some of the numbers, and we've also looked at median salary, and while that appears fairly reasonable in assessing whether or not the dollar amounts that have been arrived at for 2015 are fair and equitable and consistent with the market, I think we know that we're in the ballpark. So. With that in mind, I just want to make sure that when you do your work and what you're presenting to us reflects some of what we've hashed through today and what we've pretty much determined ought to be the scope of our review.
It certainly would. I would only, hopefully, to give reassurance to the process that we went through today. The per capita amount, I think, still played a valuable role in the discussion here.
Yeah.
The 2021 dollar amount that we've halfway come to an agreement on, based on a 5% increase plus the 1.9, is $205,474. If we go back, the per capita rate, if we were setting it today, was $205,638. Keeping in mind that the difference is one's talking about today and one's talking about 2021. There's a difference between there, but it's really not that
Well, we did
that
the
far
calculation,
apart.
I thought, for, that would take us out to 2021,
Right.
and that was like 238,000.
238.
Right.
So the difference is $33,000.
$33,000,
Right. To the point, though, it's not a bad place to add to the conversation, or I'm not quite sure whether, well, we arrived at where we arrived today, using that as part of the discussion, whether it was valuable or not.
No, I thought it was
I would
very valuable.
I would certainly not discount how we ultimately arrived at this recommendation,
No,
which took into account a
No
variety of
intent to do
different
so whatsoever.
considerations.
I think it was extremely valuable in terms of giving us some hard figures and knowing exactly what that would, what it would result in if we were to take that approach. So that was helpful. And again, my comments earlier were intended to put everything in its perspective and also to just make sure that we were cognizant of some of the potential implications beyond our assignment here. Because we always have to look at it from that perspective as well. So, okay, all right. I think we'd be appreciative of the same type of framework being provided for each of the other positions, and maybe for our next meeting, we can eliminate some of the preliminary things that we've been doing all along, because I think it's fairly well established what our purpose is in the whole 9 yards. And maybe we cut to the chase and begin that meeting with a focus on identifying base salaries for each of the classifications, starting with the mayor, solidifying that, and then using that discussion or the framework of that discussion to set our parameters for each of the other elected offices. That meeting is scheduled for the 4th of, no, I'm sorry, it was the 11th of June, right?
That's a 2-hour meeting that we have held. I guess I would ask, do we think that we can get through all this in 2 hours and solidify? If not, then I would say that we need to schedule another meeting, or extend it, or put something on our calendar.
What time is that on the 11th?
I have it from 4 to 6.
2 thumbs down on extending. And 2 thumbs up on scheduling another meeting. I don't want to be here till 7 o'clock. I just don't think that's going to be productive. For me, that's too late. So I think you are being wise to say, I don't know that that'll be enough time to wrap this up, but I don't know that I'm prepared to extend. Maybe if we're 15 minutes, 20 minutes away from a final decision, but otherwise,
Maybe
I'm
I'm
not prepared to go
determined.
till 7 o'clock.
I understood completely. Maybe I'm the eternal optimist, but I know that what we did today, we spent literally an hour and 40 minutes on just grinding through some things. We did a lot of calculations off site. So I'm hopeful that given the context of where I think our heads are at this point, that we can get through this a little bit more expeditiously when we have our next meeting. Time will tell. If everyone's comfortable with retaining the 2-hour time frame for the 11th, great. I do agree that we set another meeting. However, we do have some limitations potentially. Commission
no,
members today.
How did I forget that? I really did.
Yeah.
Okay, so that,
I have 1 more week after that day
okay.
until my due date, so.
We're gonna
I'll
get it
stay.
done.
No.
And that's if the baby comes on time or later.
You know what, that's, yeah, then maybe we do. I will stay to accommodate that. I will stay. I'm
I
happy
don't
to stay.
mind, but even if we wanted to schedule something, else in the meantime, just we're kind of running low on time if you want me to
Right,
purchase.
let's do that.
Yeah, we should.
I
person.
think we should establish
Very
a
valuable.
date, just something that works everyone's record as close as we can to the 11th, if possible, and kind of go from there.
To your point,
Is your preference to stay and just, is that your?
with an additional 2 hours and the ability to prepare, even if we're not to a point of voting at the end of the 2 hours, I gotta think that you would be giving staff just finite instruction on how to draft a recommendation to vote on at that point in time. I think we can get there, but to your point, we might want to set another date.
The next week.
Yeah.
Before the 18th,
What about
right? Okay.
the following day?
Yeah, about that.
I mean,
And I haven't scheduled pretty much anything the week of June 15th, so I'm probably a lot more flexible than you all.
16th is wide open for me, if that's not pushing me on a little too far.
I'm open between 2 and 5 on the 16th.
I know we're trying to avoid Mondays if at all possible, gentlemen, given the fact that there's a lot, Monday's a very busy day, council meeting, the whole 9 yards. That's why I skipped to Tuesday.
Thank you.
16, does the 16th work for everyone else or no?
I could be here by 3:30, if the 2 to 5 window.
I have a meeting on that day at 2 and one at 3:30. The one at 3:30, I could probably miss. I guess I can miss both if we have to. I could try to reschedule it. It's
Oh,
not
so-
ideal, though.
It sounds like the 3:30 one would be the only one that would be a conflict, given Commissioner Murdoch's challenge of getting here before 3:30 as well.
We're looking at the 16th, correct?
Correct.
Would there be any sense at seriously looking at the following day? I mean, if we're close to making a decision, or do we need a couple days to digest the meeting?
I'm in a training all day on the 12th, and I'm at a conference out of town the 17th through the 19th of the next week, so I only have the 16th.
16. I mean, just a thought, we have another meeting between now and then. In an hour, I would hope would be pretty sufficient at the end of the day.
Hopefully, maybe something like 4 to 5 on
Yeah, I mean, would that
the 16th.
be easier for
Or
you?
3. You want to do the 3? I'd rather do the 3:30 to ensure I'll have a,
Okay.
Okay.
I mean, if you're free and everybody else is free, just to ensure,
Okay.
because I'm going to have a pretty hard stop at, I will have a hard stop at 5:30. Actually, probably like 5:15. So I'd rather start at 3:30 to 5.
3:30 to 5 on the 16th.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Okay.
We will do our very best to turn around the advanced work as quickly as possible. Understanding that the sooner you have it in advance, the more time you can spend with it, and hopefully make the meeting as productive as possible on the 11th.
I just want to be clear on I want to get some clarity on what we would provide in advance of that meeting, though. Are
In
we,
advance of the 16th?
yes.
I
Are
don't
we
think we'll
doing?
know until our next meeting.
In advance of the 11th, you meant?
Yeah, in
Yeah,
advance of
The 11th.
Oh, you said what to provide in advance of the 11th?
Yeah.
Okay.
In terms of, what do you want us to provide, Commission?
If I could offer a suggestion that a lot of our attention has been focused on the annual salaries, well, maybe this is a better one, this sheet, and projecting numbers out. And maybe it'd be good to have a couple projections for what if we just stuck with 3%,
Okay.
those type of scenarios, so that we're not sending folks off to make calculations too much for each of the offices.
So at what percentages do you want that?
Probably say,
I think really, today we've looked at a range of things. We've been from 3 to upwards of, I think, as high as 7%. And a few of the other outliers, I mean, they were huge. I mean, at one point, we did a calculation that resulted in an increase of 14%, another increase of 20.6. But I think more of our discussion has been centered around that 3 to 7 range.
yeah,
Is that-
so maybe
is that reasonable?
3, 5, 7, yeah.
Mhm.
No?
Eventually, I don't want to lengthen this meeting out, but part of the way that we arrived there was going through the conversation, which if we recreated the conversation, which I can do, because I have all the notes already to get there, the calculations can be figured. However, percent change is going to matter when you look at council especially. Percent of a smaller number is a smaller number. So, for instance, what we calculated for a monetary difference on the tentative for the mayor right now is a $10,000 increase, essentially $9,956. That as a percentage of a council member's pay is a much greater percentage because you're starting with a smaller number. So, and I can tell you that where council ranks now in terms of both median salary and median per capita salary, taking the per capita off, the conversation is slightly different. But
You're not in the middle of the pack, is that what you're saying?
It's much different.
yeah, it's much different, so
For median salary?
for consistency's sake, I was planning on presenting, but with the numbers filled in, understanding the conversation today and where you arrived, following that logical progression. It does not presuppose a conclusion, which I think is something that both Rory and I are painfully sensitive to. Which was why there was a bit of consternation at the beginning of this meeting whenever you broached the subject. It would not presuppose any one set of circumstances, but provide the framework to arrive at a conversation point.
I don't think it hurts, though. I certainly respect and appreciate everything you just said. I don't think it hurts, however, to have the 3, 5, and 7 calculation already in place, so that that's one less thing that needs to be done, should we arrive at any of those numbers.
Yes.
In addition to that, maybe you could have a separate one with the per capita calculation. So
Yes.
then we'd have consistent information for each office. Is that helpful? Okay.
So just to be clear, we're gonna have 3, 5, 7 of what the per capita number would be.
That's what I'm suggesting.
And that's.
I just wanna make sure, just because I don't, when we get to the next meeting.
Right.
So that we're not calculating everything and then,
Understand.
we're at a point where we can, this is the number.
We probably will be calculating something.
Bring your calculator, all right?
We will minimize
Okay.
as much as
I'm
possible.
sure we will, but just in case.
And by we, I mean you.
Not a problem, not a problem.
I do think that, I appreciate optimism, but I think we're being very optimistic about what we can accomplish in the next meeting. And we may want to consider tackling council president and council member at the next meeting, and then the final meeting, city attorney and city auditor. And if we get further, that's a plus. But I do think as I look through the research data presentation, there are some differences in where we fall than where we fell for mayor. So I think that will, to Mr. Paul's point, I think that will play into the conversation differently than it did for our conversation for mayor. As an example, if you're to look at the residents per council member, we're number 2.
What page are you on
I'm
that
sorry,
presentation?
page 21.
Okay.
So I think that would be something important to take into consideration as we're having the council member discussion as an example.
Commissioner, regardless of how you go about it for the next meeting and the one after, whether you do 2 and then 2 again, we can still have all of the data, the projections ready for you for the June 11th meeting. So we'll have that
Still
available.
be good,
In the spirit of optimism.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, and the other part of the agenda that we didn't get to was the draft report. So that's the other part, that we have to put all this in the report. Is there anything further, I don't know if you had a chance to look at, but is there anything further that you expect at our next meeting to be completed on that?
Essentially to Rory's
I mean, I gotta do a cover page, I know that. There's, we have to add the appendices to it.
And we didn't receive this in email.
We did, okay, then I will double check and look over it.
What do you anticipate in the letter from the commission being, essentially? Just something that essentially delivers the document to
Yeah,
council?
and there was a letter that was done in conjunction with the Treasurer Review Commission, and some of the other commissions also did letters So we're kind of following that practice of things.
To Commissioner Don Tyler Lee's point, also an opportunity to lessons learned or things gained through this process.
Yes.
Words of wisdom to impart upon the next commission.
Absolutely. Included among the recommendations is hire a consultant. Let the consultant come back to us with recommendations. Act upon. Stuff is beyond our, absolutely. Very good. Is there anything else we need to take care of today? We're set for the 11th and subsequently on the 16th from 3:30 to 5. Okay. There's nothing further than the 7th meeting is adjourned. Thank you all very, very much for all the hard work today and for your patience in walking us through a tedious but nonetheless very important process. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're cutting it close. Cutting it really close.